Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second of two recent live episodes of PPF that we recorded in front of an audience. This one in Bath as part of the Curious Minds Festival. It's a conversation with regular PPF guest, historian of modern Britain, Robert Saunders, and we're talking about Winston Churchill. There are lots of reasons to talk about Churchill. One of which, as you'll hear in a moment, is that 2025 is a year chock full of Churchill anniversaries from 1965, 45, 25, 1915. So many things happened in Churchill's life in years ending with a 5, and yet there's so much more to Churchill's life than that. This is an attempt to make sense of it all. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming out on this lovely, sunny Bath morning to hear a live recording of the Past, Present, Future podcast. Robert Saunders is a regular guest on this podcast, and we are here to talk about Winston Churchill. And I want to say up front, not because we're fanboys and we just like talking about Churchill. There are lots of podcasts like that out there. This is not one of those. The prompt for this event was realizing that this year, 2025, marks a series of Churchill anniversaries, and it's quite a bizarre set of anniversaries that convey just what a checkered political career he had. So this is the 60th anniversary of his death in 1965, state funeral, the glory of the nation. It's the 80th anniversary of 1945, which was the apotheosis of his career, his great triumph, victory in the Second World War, VE Day, and also the great rejection of his career, the great rebuke, unless the fact that his father seems to have been disappointed in him is the real story, and we'll come on to that. But the defeat in the 1945 general election, just 11 weeks after VE Day, the British public rejected him. It is the 100th anniversary in 1925 of the greatest mistake, probably, of his political career when, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he took Britain back onto the gold standard at the wrong rate and squeezed the life out of the British economy. It's the anniversary from 1915, the 110th anniversary of his greatest personal disaster, the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, for which many people held him personally responsible, the deaths of tens of thousands of men. And it's hard to think how a single political career can encompass all of this. And yet that's not even the half of it. He was in Parliament from 1900 to 1964. So when he entered Parliament, Queen Victoria was on the throne. And when he left, the Beatles had broken America. And within that career, we've called this the politician with 9 lives. There are so many different Churchills. And had he been killed at any particular moment, and he led a very dangerous life, there were lots of near-death experiences, he would have been a completely different political figure in historical memory. So we're going to be talking about the different Churchills and whether there's a thread that connects them all. But Robert, you're a historian, among other things, of 20th century British politics. How is it possible to encompass a career that begins in 1900 and ends in 1964? There isn't another political career like it, I think, in the history of British politics, maybe of world politics. How do you make sense of it?
Well, I must say, listening to all of those anniversaries you were listing, I was thinking we're going to be here for days, so strap yourselves in. I think in some ways the longevity is actually what defines him, and it's why we have to think in terms of the different lives of Winston Churchill in a way that we don't talk about the different lives of Rishi Sunak or of David Cameron.
Or of Liz Truss.
Quite, yes. I think the first biography of Winston Churchill was published in 1905. So that long before the World Wars, before he's even become a minister, he's already somebody that other politicians think you should be writing books about and that the public wants to read books about. As David said, he's born in 1874 when Gladstone and Disraeli are competing for power, when Verdi's Requiem is being produced, when Thomas Hardy is publishing Far from the Madding Crowd. He dies when the Soviets have put a man in space and there's a Cold War going on between nuclear superpowers. So even if Churchill himself had remained exactly the same, the world around him is constantly changing. The challenges that he's facing are constantly changing. The possible alliances and coalitions that are open to him are different. And so part of the genius of Churchill actually is his ability to keep reinventing himself, which doesn't mean he has no principles, but to keep applying those principles to different historical contexts.
So we're going to try and make sense of the different phases of his career, and then we're going to talk about what might connect them, how he's remembered now, because Churchill is still everywhere in British political imagination. He entered the House of Commons in 1900. He was already famous. So he was famous pretty much all his life, and he had made himself famous by that point. He was known as a journalist, a soldier, an adventurer, a self-publicist, a sort of romantic imperialist. He entered the House of Commons as a Conservative. Do you think he was a Conservative?
I think it's the natural choice for him in 1900 for a number of reasons. So it was his father's party. His father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, had held a number of roles in government. It's the party of empire. And as you say, Churchill comes into politics as a great imperial hero. And he's also someone who has a deep sense of English history and of the rootedness of the present in the past. So it makes a lot of sense, but he's always quite loosely attached to the Conservative Party. Even at that point, he will tell friends, of course, I'm really a liberal. Because although he's an imperialist, he's what's described at the time as a liberal imperialist. He's somebody who believes in free trade. And although he's in some ways rooted in the establishment, he's what we sometimes think of as an insider-outsider, in the sense that his grandfather is the Duke of Marlborough. He's born in Blenheim Palace. His father's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's rooted in the establishment. But he's also not. He has an American mother. His family are quite poor by the standards of his social class. One reason why he writes so much is because he has to keep generating the wealth to maintain this kind of lifestyle. So the Conservative Party is a vehicle for him, but he doesn't have the sort of commitment to party that most politicians do. And that means that he can, without in his own mind sacrificing any of his principles, move from one side to the other according to the kind of pressures and the opportunities of the moment.
And in that early career, he was already known, I think, as someone who was reckless. I mean, the young Churchill, there are many books even now written about the young Churchill, soldier, adventurer. He had a few of those near-death experiences pretty early on. But as an insider-outsider, he was also known to be someone from the beginning who wasn't entirely politically reliable. Would that be fair?
Yes, it would. I think it's almost certainly going to take something on the scale of a world war to make Churchill Prime Minister, because all the way through his life, people are suspicious of his judgment. And that comes, I think, from quite deep-rooted things in his political makeup. So something that runs across Churchill's career is his extraordinary sense of destiny. He's not conventionally religious, but he does have a sense that fate has something in store for him, that he will in some way be connected to the greatness of his country. And that means that he's always looking for that great moment of destiny. He's always looking for the remarkable thing that he can do. And of course, in the Second World War, we could say he meets that destiny and he carves his name in history. But there are all sorts of unsuccessful efforts on the way, whether it's the struggle against Gandhi, or whether it's the Gallipoli campaign, or whether it's some of his interest in things like eugenic science in the early part of his career, where he's following false trails of destiny. And that does make him willing to roll the dice. It also actually makes him physically courageous. He will do extraordinary things on the battlefield because he simply cannot believe that what destiny has in store for him is a bullet on a battlefield that no one's really paying any attention to. So his fundamental attribute, his sense of destiny, does make him reckless and adventurous.
And we could spend a lot of time doing this as a sort of psychological study, and maybe we can touch on this as we go through. But one of the things that is widely known about Churchill is that he was depressive, and he was depressive throughout his life. And physical courage sometimes goes with that attribute. Depressive soldiers are also sometimes very brave. Depression and a sense of destiny, it's an odd combination. I think it's not an inexplicable combination. I think it's fair to say, throughout his life, always looking for the thing that will give it a deeper meaning. He likes to raise the stakes. I think that's a characteristic across his career. Most politicians would be destroyed by having a sense of destiny because, as you say, until the moment arrives, he keeps slightly blundering it. One of the questions about Churchill is how does he sustain a career through so many false steps on the road to that sense of destiny? And it begins with switching parties, which not in every case, but in most cases is fatal to a long-term political career. So in 1904, I think that's right, he leaves the Conservatives and joins the Liberal Party and reveals himself to be a different kind of politician. So a word that then could be applied to him is that he's a radical. I mean, how big a switch is that? Because that in itself, if you just time slice his career, the first decade of the 20th century, the thing that stands out is he switched sides, but he didn't just switch sides, he completely switched political clothes. He became a different kind of politician, and his reputation for being untrustworthy, unreliable, is enhanced by that. What was that switch? Was it a switch of identity?
Well, of course, Churchill is almost unique among major politicians in that he switched party twice,
Yeah.
and he was very proud of that. He said anybody could rat once, it takes a special genius to rat twice. I think he would have claimed, with some justice, that there is actually a continuity between his Tory phase and his Liberal phase. His father's great phrase was Tory democracy. So he understood himself as a radical Tory, whose Toryism is rooted in service of ordinary people. And he becomes a radical Liberal. And he becomes particularly closely associated with Lloyd George. And as a minister, he's very involved in the early stages for the welfare state. He's very involved in things like minimum wages for what are called sweated trades. He's one of the architects of national insurance. And that for him isn't simply a conversion to someone else's programme. That's an expression of his most deep-rooted political principle, which is imperialism. Because the case for welfare before the First World War isn't principally philanthropic, it's military. It's the idea that if we're going to fight a great war against Germany or France or the United States, we must have an imperial race that is capable of fighting. He, like many of his contemporaries, have been very scarred by the Boer War, in which something like 20% of recruits had been turned down on the basis they were medically unfit to fight. So minimum wages, free school meals, unemployment insurance, health insurance. This is partly about ensuring that you have a race that can compete in the struggle for imperial power that Churchill is convinced is going to shape the century.
I mentioned at the beginning that he was a disappointment to his father, and you've said his politics were shaped by his father. Churchill does come up a lot in the podcast world, in very different podcasts from this one, so naming no names, but in what's called the manosphere. I heard recently a podcast that took Churchill's father's letter to him. I think it was after he'd failed to get into Sandhurst for the second time, something like that, telling him what a profound disappointment he was. As an example, it was given to young men that there's nothing better in early life than to be told by your father you're a disappointment to drive you on. And this is the kind of thing that we all need to learn and toughen up from. And Churchill should be a role model for that. So I'm not going to ask you a manosphere question. Should Churchill be a role model for that? But do you think it is plausible psychologically? I mean, here he is, he's following in his father's footsteps. His politics are shaped by his father's politics. But his relationship with his father was pretty toxic, actually. And his father died when he was very young. So his father would have seen none of this extraordinary career. Do you think there is a sense that his father's shadow haunted him?
I think it's certainly there, and we know later in life he writes accounts of imaginary conversations with his father in which he tries to explain to him all of the successful things that he's done, and his father simply won't listen. And I think in one version his father says, "Oh, you should have gone into politics." I do think there are many readings of Churchill, and there are many readings of Churchill that we should ignore, and the one that should be absolutely bottom of the list is the kind of manosphere, machismo reading of Churchill. Churchill is somebody who cries regularly and openly and in public. He is somebody who is deeply depressed. He's somebody who has an overwhelming sense of his own failure. And if somebody with all of the talents and gifts and achievements of Churchill can struggle in that way with depression and with his emotions, then I think we probably do need to banish the idea that there is something manly about not doing those things, that there is something weak about those situations.
So one more question about, let's call it the second phase of Churchill's career. So there's the young Tory imperialist adventurer who switches sides. And I think he was the youngest. He became a cabinet minister at 33, I think the youngest since the 1860s. So he's a prodigy. He's a political prodigy, ally of Lloyd George, part of the great reforming Liberal government under Asquith. and an ally of Lloyd George and Asquith, and eventually he became Home Secretary. And he is a champion, as you say, of many of those reforming policies. It's a kind of, it's a new welfare age for the British Empire. But also as Home Secretary, there's one presiding image from this time. There were many famous images of Churchill, but this is one that comes up a lot. As Home Secretary, the Sydney Street siege in 1911, when some Latvian anarchists were holed up in a house, and in the end the police were outgunned by them and the army had to be called in. The house burned down, and it's not just apocryphal because Churchill confirmed it, that as Home Secretary he told the fire brigade not to put out the flames, and so the men burned to death inside. And there's a picture of him in his top hat and his coat as Home Secretary watching this unfold. And it was thought at the time to be shocking that a politician would attend the scene of an event like this. And it reinforced, I think, in a lot of people's minds, not just that Churchill was reckless, but he had a kind of taste for blood or for violence or for a certain kind of showy version of real confrontational physical politics. He was a very brave person. He was a depressive person. He had seen action already in his life. But that side of him, that desire to be on the scene where the blood is being spilled, is that a thread in his career? It feels to me like that's part of the key to this. And whether it's to do with the depression or something else, I don't know.
I think it goes back to the point about Churchill responding to different contexts and conditions. So the first thing to say, I think, is that Britain before the First World War is an extremely violent and dangerous society. There is a sort of mythic version of Edwardian Britain in which everyone's playing tennis on the vicarage lawn. In fact, you have suffragettes burning down churches. You have a situation close to civil war in Ulster, and you have the worst industrial discontent that Britain has seen and will see again until the general strike. This is a point at which there are warships going up the River Mersey in order to be prepared to deal with strikes among dock workers. So the fear of civic violence is intense throughout politics, and Churchill isn't alone in grappling with the questions that raises. I think he is unusual, and this is noticed by his contemporaries, in his zeal for the fight. That Churchill is exhilarated by the idea of conflict, that Churchill believes that history is made in conflict. Even when he's talking about old age pensions, the imagery he uses is always military. He talks about great reserve armies coming down the line. He talks about poverty and affluence locked in combat, moving forwards and backwards. Everything for Churchill has to be a great struggle between cosmic forces in a battle that will shape the future of the universe. And of course, in 1940, he finds a threat that's big enough for his rhetoric. But one problem with his career is he's always elevating the threat in front of him to this kind of level. And so when he sees Latvian anarchists in Sydney streets, or when he sees striking workers in Tonypandy, he tends to see the revolution and the great collision of our time. And that is a problem, and it's a reason why his contemporaries are nervous about putting him in charge of sensitive things.
Of course, in 1914, let's move on to another phase of his career. By 1914, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and an occasion arose that did suit the level of his rhetoric. The First World War broke out, and there are many accounts of how, among the political classes, the outbreak of the war was a deep shock. It was a trauma. It felt like a failure. There was a sense of bleakness, famous lines, including "the lights are being put out across Europe. They will not be lit again in our lifetime." But as people noted, Winston is high as a kite. I mean, Winston is exhilarated because Winston feels that something has clicked in with his sense of destiny. I don't know if people have read Robert Harris's most recent book, Precipice, which is about Asquith's on again, off again, consummated, unconsummated, we don't know, love affair with the young Venetia Stanley. But one of the themes of that book is that Asquith took his eye off the ball because he was so besotted with this young woman during the first year of the First World War. And the crucial mistake that he made was he took his eye off Churchill, because Churchill was like a wound-up doll fighting for some place to achieve that sense of destiny. And he thought he'd discovered it in Gallipoli in the Dardanelles. He was going to take the fight to the Ottoman Empire, and it was a catastrophe for which Churchill was personally responsible. But the implication of the novel is that Asquith was responsible too, because everyone knows the first rule of politics is don't let Winston off the leash. And it almost destroyed him. I mean, the other thing about Churchill's career is that it does have, just in political terms, these near-death moments. And one of them is the aftermath of the Gallipoli campaign, when the Conservative Party in particular, still remembering that he had betrayed them, was determined to destroy him. How did he survive it? He was identified with what was perhaps the greatest military disaster of the First World War personally, but it didn't finish him.
I think Churchill's relationship with war is quite complicated, and I said just now that Churchill is exhilarated by war, and actually I'm not sure that's quite right. I think he has an extraordinary sense of the power of war, which means he can be exhilarated by it, but he's also horrified by it. He's very aware of its destructive power and the inability to control war. There is a sense it's like a raging fire that once it's begun, you can't be sure what it's going to destroy. Churchill loves the idea of war as an arena for heroism and glory, but he absolutely doesn't love the idea that hundreds of thousands of troops are dug in across the Western Front, being mown down by machine guns and dying on barbed wire. For Churchill, there is absolutely nothing heroic about that at all. And actually, one of Churchill's more admirable qualities, I think, in the First World War is he's always looking for ways to stop the bloodshed on the Western Front. He's always interested in new technologies that might allow you to break through trench warfare. So he's someone who pushes very hard for the tank. But he's also always interested in how can you in some way outflank this. So the Gallipoli campaign is in some ways, dazzling idea that you send the fleet up the Dardanelles, you take Constantinople, what's now Istanbul, you knock the Turkish Empire out of the war, you relieve the pressure on Russia's southern front, you open up the Black Sea route to Russia for trade and for rearmament, you potentially open up the flank of the Habsburg Empire. So it's a wonderful idea. Instead, what happens is the fleet gets bogged down, troops land, you in fact get trench warfare there too, and you end up with a bloodbath in which around 100,000 Allied troops are killed.
Many of them Australian.
Many of them, yeah, so it becomes a kind of birth moment in Australian and New Zealand nationalism. So it's a kind of horrifying moment in the war, and it's a devastating moment for Churchill personally. Interestingly, one of the last people off the beaches in Gallipoli is a young soldier called Clement Attlee, who actually always believed that the Gallipoli campaign could have worked, that the strategy was right, that the problem was with the execution. So it's very important in the Second World War that Churchill's deputy in the war is someone who actually does trust Churchill's military judgment and thinks that what Churchill needs is competent people around him who help him to deliver the vision, rather than kind of cautious people who throttle that vision.
Yeah, I mean, I think Attlee's presence at Gallipoli is one of those weird clues in 20th century British history without which the story doesn't make sense. We'll come on to what happened in 1940, but that bond between them, which was unusual because not everybody else blamed Churchill, but pretty much everybody else blamed Churchill. And Attlee saw some truly terrible things. I mean, it was a horrifying experience. And as you say, he was one of the last people to be evacuated, and many of his comrades were killed. And not only did he not blame Churchill, he blamed the generals. He blamed the sort of hidebound military leadership that couldn't understand Churchill's political military genius. And that was a key to their relationship in the Second World War, which was in some ways a key to what happened in that war. So we'll come on to that. He did survive, Churchill. One of the things he did after the Gallipoli campaign and after he had to leave the government was to go to the Western Front. There's a sense of expiation there as well. And he very nearly got himself killed. And I suspect if he had got himself killed, he might have felt that was an appropriate way to go. But he didn't. He survived. I want to ask you about a next phase in his career, because one of those anniversaries that I mentioned, and we're taking a big leap here, but it's such another huge switch. If you move forward from 1915 to 1925 and you do a snapshot again of Churchill, suddenly he switched parties again. He's a conservative again. He survived Gallipoli. He survived the First World War. He reinvented his political career. And astonishingly, he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is not a job for which he is well suited. I suspect he himself knew. Stanley Baldwin has made him Chancellor of the Exchequer. And as Chancellor of the Exchequer, quite early on, he faces this agonizing decision: should Britain go back on the gold standard, and at what rate? And people like John Maynard Keynes are really warning him against trying to go back to the way it used to be before the First World War. Particularly, don't go back on the gold standard at the rate that Britain was on gold before 1914. But he does it under Treasury pressure. I think he's one of those chancellors, we may have another one now, who is hemmed in by what the Treasury tells them is and isn't possible. And it's another disaster. I mean, I think it's fair to say, for many people, it's one of the great mistakes of 20th century British political history. How does he survive that one?
Well, as you say, he's an unlikely pick for Chancellor of the Exchequer simply because he's so utterly financially incontinent himself. I think someone suggests at the time that his strategy for the national finances is that everybody should write lots of books. As you say, it's part of his shift back to the Conservative Party, and I think it's worth saying something about that.
Yeah.
It's partly pragmatic that Churchill, because he has this sense of destiny, Churchill has to have his hand on the tiller of the state. He has to be in a position where he can drive what the government is doing. And the Liberal Party has now collapsed in the First World War, so if he wants a vehicle, he has to move. And it can't be the Labour Party, because the other driver is ideological. That's one of Churchill's most fundamental precepts is his anti-socialism. And particularly after 1917, he looks at the Labour Party and he sees Bolshevism, he sees the revolution in Russia and all of the terrors that that's going to unleash across Europe. So the big questions of politics aren't anymore Home Rule for Ireland or Welsh disestablishment, or even to the same extent free trade. It's now where you stand on the question of socialism. So that carries him into the Conservative Party. But he's in this curious position for himself. And I think it is an undistinguished period in his career because it doesn't connect to the things that he really believes in. It's not about empire. It's not about war. It's not about the future of the nation as he understands it. And so because of that, he makes this terrible error. But he does so largely because he accepts expert advice. He does what almost every Treasury official is telling him to do. He does actually what Labour's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowden, thinks that he ought to do. And whereas on matters military, Churchill is always pushing back against the experts. He always thinks he knows better than the generals and the admirals. At the Exchequer, he knows that he doesn't. So unusually, Churchill is slightly intellectually modest as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that's what drives him into disaster.
It is, I think, part of his genius, as you described it. A lot of people clung on to the Liberal Party past the point where it was going to have a future. But his sense of destiny is one of the things that leads him to jump when he has to jump. Asquith is still going, Lloyd George is still going. Those people with whom he had worked, and I think who had in some ways forgiven him for many of the things that the Conservatives didn't forgive him for in the First World War. But he could see they were not, if you have a sense of destiny, they were no longer destiny. And destiny did drag him to where he needed to be. But then it was a disaster. Had he been run over by a bus in, say, 1928, so in 1926, there was a general strike. The British economy, after Churchill's decision, has the life squeezed out of it. Deflation takes hold. It's a really tough time. This is before the Great Depression. The late 1920s are a tough time. Had he been killed in 1928, he would have been someone by whom people had been fascinated already for a quarter of a century, someone of whom biographies had already been written, someone whose young life was extraordinary and exotic. But as a politician, late 1920s, he was a significant enough figure that people would remember him. But he would be remembered, wouldn't he, as one of the great failures of British politics?
It might depend which phase of his career they were looking at. I mean, of course, from the 1940s onwards, people are starting to write the history of the welfare state. And at that point, Churchill becomes, of course, an important political figure in a different way, as someone who's laid many of the foundations for the welfare state. But yes, and I think Churchill himself is aware of this. He has a sense there is a destiny coming for him, but he might be cut off before he gets there.
Yeah. He needs to watch which way he crosses the street.
Absolutely, yes.
So then there's the period of his career, the 1930s, which is remembered, I think, with hindsight, getting closer to the point where the story starts to lead up to his moment of destiny. So in the historical memory of this period, Churchill in the 1930s is a kind of prophet in the wilderness. He's cast out from government politics. He remains a member of parliament, but he's a backbench MP. He has a circle of people around him. People are still fascinated by him. They want to know what Winston thinks. He makes flowery speeches in the House of Commons and outside too. He writes an awful lot. I mean, the words flow out of him. He drinks an awful lot. The champagne and cognac flow into him. But the memory is that this is the period where he is warning against the thing that other people are trying to avoid, which is the threat of Hitler's Germany. But I think at the time, probably people would have thought that he was at least as visible for, and maybe more visible for, another set of warnings, which is warnings about India and warnings about Gandhi. I mean, there are two causes that he takes up in the 1930s, and in historical memory, on one of them he was right, don't trust Hitler, and arm against him. But on the other one, he was wrong.
Well, there are three causes that he takes up in the 1930s. There is the crusade against Nazism, there is his hostility to Gandhi and to self-government for India. There's also the cause of Edward VIII. He's very active in the abdication crisis.
I forgot about that.
And these three things are connected. I think Roy Jenkins has a nice line somewhere in his biography where he says, Churchill was an alarm clock, but he was one that rang too often. And that is a real problem, because Churchill spends much of the 1930s making long, rolling speeches about the dangers of tyranny and the threat to civilization and the rise of dark forces, but he's talking about Gandhi. And he's talked about socialism in the same way in the past. He's talked about Bolshevism. It is a problem that Churchill increasingly only seems to have one rhetorical register. And so people become kind of desensitized to it. And we almost in the 1930s, I think, see the kind of two sides of Churchill in combat. Because on the one hand, he is undoubtedly extraordinarily perceptive about the threat that Nazism poses in a way that most of his contemporaries are not. He's also actually tactically and strategically quite supple in how he responds to that. So, as someone who has deplored Bolshevism, he's very early in calling for an alliance with the Soviet Union. As someone who's been a hate figure to the Labour Party, he's very active at going out and building connections with figures in the Labour Party, building connections with a figure like Walter Citrine of the Trades Union Congress. He starts to work closely with the League of Nations Union, which hasn't been a particular interest of his before. When he publishes his speeches on Nazism, it's called Arms and the Covenant. He's talking about the League of Nations covenant there. So he's actually very skillfully trying to build a kind of popular front of support for rearmament. But then in the middle of it, he'll come down to the House of Commons and make a ludicrous speech about Edward VIII, or he'll make an extraordinary speech about Gandhi that blows that coalition to pieces. So we see both the wise prophetic Churchill and the catastrophic, ill-judged Churchill almost in a struggle with one another.
And as you're speaking, it does feel like, I don't know if this is the thread, but for a politician who has a sense of destiny, you can think of that in two ways. So having a sense of destiny can make you sort of static, fixed, kind of closed off in some ways. You have this understanding of yourself around which the world turns, or it can make you flexible, adaptable, because you've got to seize your destiny. And as the world changes, in the famous phrase, when the world changes, do you change or do you not change? And Churchill, almost uniquely, when we think about these many lives, it's because he has these different guises. But he has these different guises because the thing that connects them is the grasping for the big thing that might be coming. But that also means he's going to get things wrong. And in a way, the 1930s is almost the quintessence of Churchill as a man of destiny, not because he's right about everything or he takes a fixed course, but because he is moving around looking for the coalition that will allow him to seize his moment, which in 1940 he does.
I think it's perhaps a problem that we all have imprinted in our minds, I think, a certain image of Churchill, which is the elderly Churchill, with the stoop and the scowl, and a Churchill who's mobilising the English language and sending it out to war, who in some ways seems like a very backward figure, the last figure of a grand age. And yet, in many ways, Churchill is a futurist. Because he has this sense of destiny, he's always looking forward and trying to spot what's coming next. And that's true not just in big picture political terms, it's true in things like how he responds to technology. Part of Churchill's fame today is about his radio broadcasts and his extraordinary skill as a broadcaster. The first prime ministerial broadcast happens in 1924 when Churchill is 50. So this is a technology that emerges quite late in his life. And The annals of British politics are strewn with the corpses of politicians who are very good platform orators but cannot adapt to the age of radio or television. Churchill learns how to do it. He learns very deliberately because this is a new technology that he can use and he can harness. So he looks forward all the time, and often he sees the wrong thing, or he sees dangers that don't transpire. But of course, on this one big question, he sees correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Gordon Brown and Twitter. There are politicians and the new technology, it can go really badly wrong. Do you think, I'm going to ask you what is often the central question about Churchill, and I ask it genuinely as an open question. In May 1940, Neville Chamberlain resigned, and the Conservative Party faced a choice, Halifax or Churchill. And there are lots of explanations of why, in the end, it wasn't Halifax. Did Halifax himself duck when the opportunity was offered to him? Did the party balk? Was it to do with actually soundings that were taken in the Labour Party about whether a coalition would hold? And actually, does it go back to Attlee and Churchill's connection, which has its roots in 1915? Attlee, I think, was pretty clear in his own mind in May 1940 that the government in which he and the Labour Party would sow would have to be led by Churchill, not Halifax. Is it the great pivot of 20th century British history, those few days in May? There are many books with titles a bit like that. But when Churchill and his destiny finally, the alarm rings and it's time to get up, when that moment happens, is it the hinge of 20th century British history? Would we be living in a completely different world if the Conservative Party had chosen Halifax?
I'm always a bit sceptical of the idea that there is a hinge or there is a pivot point. The Second World War develops the way it does because of the actions of millions of people all the way across the globe, not just those who fight, but those who are involved in industry, manufacture, those who are creating public opinion, those who are writing, those who are speaking. It's very difficult, I think, to say that it's simply everything hinges on the choice of one person. Nonetheless, he is the person who is chosen at that moment, and that clearly is significant. And that shapes both the policy of the war, but also, of course, how we remember the war, that he writes the words through which we remember the war. And it's become, I think, fashionable in some quarters to talk about Churchill sort of as if he won the war single-handedly and somehow infused the country with his own extraordinary spirit. That wasn't a claim that he ever made himself. He famously said, the British people were the lion, it was my privilege to give the roar. He sees himself in a kind of expressive role as someone who projects what others are feeling and wanting to do.
It's such an amazing political life. And just what happened in 1945 is unique, I think, in British political history. A politician who in 1945, in May 1945, was identified by the British people, even if they were the lion and he was the roar, as the man who won the war. The famous scene when on VE Day, he's on the balcony of the Ministry of Health speaking to the crowds below, and he says to them, "It was your victory." And they shout back, "No, it was your victory." And they meant it. And then 11 weeks later, they voted for a Labour government. And it was partly because, I think, the Labour Party skillfully managed to remind people that Churchill wasn't just VE Day Churchill. Churchill was those earlier Churchills, but particularly 1920s and 1930s Churchill. If you had to say how and why he lost in 1945, is that the explanation that actually his past came back to haunt him, or the past of his party, the Conservative Party, came back to haunt them?
I think it's a couple of different things. It's partly that there is a fair amount of opinion polling, actually, that takes place during the war, which is quite interesting. So we do have a sense of how people felt about Churchill. And I think it's fairly clear that if the question is, who do you want to lead Britain in the war? The answer is Mr. Churchill. If the question is, who do you want to lead Britain in the peace? The answer is not Mr. Churchill. And even more importantly, the answer is not the Conservative Party. So something that Labour is very skillful at doing in 1945 is saying, cheer Churchill, vote Labour. So celebrate the glorious leadership of Mr. Churchill in war. But the questions of peace now are about how do we construct a national health service? How do we ensure that mass unemployment never returns? How do we build a world that is fit for the returning soldiers in a way that we singularly failed to do in 1918, in that period when Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer? So Labour manages to change the question and say, It's about reconstruction and it's about peace, rather than a kind of thank you gift to Mr. Churchill. But they're also very skilled at separating Churchill from the Conservative Party and saying the Conservative Party is the party that brought you mass unemployment in the 1930s. It's the party that gave you appeasement. It's the party that left Britain undefended in 1939. Now, that might in all sorts of ways be an unfair critique of the Conservative record, but it's one that in a sense Churchill himself has helped to develop in his own criticisms of the Conservative Party in that period. And the vast majority of people in the country are not being asked to vote for Mr. Churchill. They're being asked to vote for their local Conservative candidates. And that is a very different question.
And you could say the life that we've sketched out here, if you dig deep enough into it, you go way back, you can find, as you said, Churchill, who laid the foundations for the original welfare state. Churchill, liberal, radical of the period before the First World War. But already by 1945, too many things have been laid on top of that. You're not going to win an election in 1945 by trying to remind people of the Churchill of 1909. It's just too long a life. It has too much in it. And the thing that looms large is wartime Churchill and peacetime Churchill. And peacetime Churchill does mean the 1930s.
And of course, Churchill himself, very helpfully for Labour, reminds the public of 1930s Churchill. He gives a devastatingly damaging broadcast during the election, which becomes known as his crazy broadcast, in which he says that a Labour government would need some kind of Gestapo, no doubt in the first instance very humanely administered. Now, he's suggesting that a government led by his own deputy prime minister is going to introduce something like the Nazi secret police. His wife begs him not to say it. In all sorts of ways, Clemmy has much better judgment than Winston does for much of his career, but he does say it, and it's a catastrophe. And it's not the moment that changes the election, but it's an important moment because it crystallises that sense that Churchill is a great leader in time of war, but he is not the man that you want at the tiller in normal conditions. His judgment often is extremely poor.
So, Robert, I want to ask you two more questions and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. One more phase of his career, because there's still a long way to go. I mean, it's mind-boggling. You'd think in 1945, and I think he himself thought in 1945 that was probably it. But he's going to be Prime Minister again in 1951, and he's going to inherit Labour's welfare state, and he is going to preserve it. He's not going to do much as early 1950s Prime Minister. He's old by that point. He's not particularly well, but he does come back. How would you characterize Churchill as Prime Minister 2.0?
I think there's a domestic and an international element, of which the second is more important. So domestically, in some ways, Churchill accidentally comes to crystallise the post-war settlement, in that Churchill doesn't have a problem with the welfare state. As we've seen, he's been a pioneer of it. He doesn't have a problem with state welfare. What he does have a problem with is state planning and control of the economy. Churchill is fundamentally a free marketeer. So the sort of settlement that emerges after the 1950, in which you have a large welfare state but a largely free economy with nationalised industries, is actually something that Churchill is very happy with. But Churchill's principal concern in that premiership, and he spends large parts of that premiership in bed. He has a series of strokes while he's Prime Minister. He's essentially not fit to be Prime Minister for much of that period. But he stays because his sense of destiny is still firing. And his new destiny is to save the world from nuclear apocalypse. That Churchill actually has an extraordinary horror of the new weapons that the Second World War has unleashed, and a sense that if there is a Third World War, humanity will not survive it. So going back to our discussion about war, and I said Churchill is in some ways horrified by war. He's absolutely horrified by war in the 1950s. So he sees himself at that point as a peace prime minister whose last great task is to bring the Soviet Union and the United States and France and Britain together in a new kind of great power congress that will save the world from destruction.
And I said I was going to ask you two more questions. I'm going to ask you two more questions from now. I mean, something that you've just touched on, but coming to the big question of whether there's a thread that runs through this, his relationship with the United States, the fact that he was part American himself, the fact that he was a futurist, and the United States was the future in the first half of the 20th century. I read recently that though he was publicly supportive, he was privately horrified by Suez. And he partly continued in politics because he thought he had to repair relationships with the United States after that fiasco. Is America potentially the key to this, that he was a part American prime minister? Not literally, but in his political imagination?
I think one of the myths around Churchill is that he's often used as a kind of shorthand for the idea that Britain is at its best when Britain stands alone. And I think that's a fundamental misreading of Churchill. Actually, if we look at the wartime speeches in which he talks about standing alone, he always talks about the British Empire and Commonwealth standing alone. Churchill is always looking for allies and partners. He actually has quite a coldly realist sense of the limits on Britain's strength as an island. So that's partly why he's an imperialist. He sees this as the great battery pack that fires British power. The United States is part of that conception because it's not part of the empire, but it's part of the English-speaking world. And increasingly, in the late part of his career, when the empire has largely disintegrated, it's the successor to it. So we move from Churchill the imperialist to Churchill the advocate of the special relationship.
Churchill gets used and abused a lot in contemporary politics, and he can be characterized in every way imaginable. You find someone who's willing to say he was a genocidal imperialist responsible for the Bengal famine. He was the savior of his nation, and Brexit is done in his honor. There are a million different ways that Churchill gets used, but they tend to want to characterize him as one version of himself. I think Brexit Churchill is one version of Churchill. Imperialist Churchill, and the record is not good. I mean, I think it's fair to say, particularly in relation to India, is one version of Churchill. As a historian who studies contemporary politics and sees the way that political figures get used and abused, and there is no one like Churchill for this, no one. And he gets used and abused in the United States, my God, just as much, if not more. The question of whether his bust is or isn't in the Oval Office is one of the central questions of American politics. Do you think in the end, actually, that all of these are a kind of abuse of history, in the sense that it's very hard in a contemporary political setting to do the version that says there are 9 Churchills? Like I was saying, in 1945, if the Conservative Party had said, that's not Churchill, look, here are 6 other Churchills, take your pick, no one's going to believe them. Do you think in the end that Churchill is emblematic of the way in which contemporary politics really can only offer a caricature of history? That's a leading question, I know.
I think Churchill is one of those figures who has passed from history into myth. And of course, the nature of myth is that myths aren't stories that are untrue necessarily. They are stories that are told that have a certain meaning imprinted upon them. And every generation tells them in different ways. So if we think about a classic myth like Robin Hood, there is a socialist version of Robin Hood, in which Robin is the champion of the common man who steals from the rich and gives to the poor and defies authority. But there's an aristocratic version of Robin Hood, in which he is the Earl of Locksley. He is the faithful servant of the true King Richard, who, in a paternalist way, looks after his people and is restored to his estates in a happy ending. And there are umpteen other versions of Robin Hood as well. And in the same way with Churchill, we have Brexit Churchill and Remainer Churchill. We have Trump Churchill and Zelensky Churchill. And the problem is that this tends to produce very cartoonish, parodic versions of Churchill that strip away all of the things that actually make Churchill interesting. So I think perhaps the most destructive example of this recently has been, I hesitate to name Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson's book, The Churchill Factor, explicitly sets out to teach a lesson. He says at the start that the life of Winston Churchill is a pretty withering rebuke to all that malarkey about great social forces driving history. What the life of Churchill teaches us is that a man who believes in his country can achieve anything. And that really the secret of politics is just about having a bit more lead in your psychological pencil. It's just about boosterism. And that is extraordinary. And firstly, because if you make the story of Churchill a story of willpower, as we've discussed, Churchill's willpower often leads him in catastrophic directions. It leads him to Gallipoli. It leads him to Dieppe. It doesn't only lead to 1940. But also it strips away Churchill the compromiser. That Churchill, the man who allies with the Soviet Union in order to defeat Nazism, who builds relationships with the Labour Party in order to defeat Nazism. somebody who is actually willing to sacrifice large parts of his beloved empire in order to win American support during the war. Someone who has a coldly realist sense of Britain's need for allies, a need for support, and things that need to be traded. And we strip all of that away and turn him into a sort of Marvel Comic Universe version of Churchill, in which he kind of dons his cape and his costume and flies up into the sky. And I think that version of Churchill has been extremely damaging.
And I suppose the other thing that you could say is that politicians of destiny set a bad example for politicians who think that they are also politicians of destiny. There's no question that Boris Johnson, and it may be true, it may be part of the psychological makeup of many politicians, actually. I don't think we should single out Johnson. You do, in a way, have to believe that when you and history come together, important things will happen. And Churchill is the supreme example of that. But for that reason, he's a very bad influence.
Well, if I could just add one other thought there. Churchill was very aware that destiny can be tragic. If you look back at his wartime speeches, something I think that's particularly interesting about them is that they are full of the possibility of defeat. Churchill is explicit in his speeches that Britain might in fact lose this war. If you look at a speech like, "We will fight them on the beaches," it's actually a story of retreat. We will fight them in France. We will fight them in the seas. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them on the landing platforms. We will fight them in the streets and in the hills. And he says, if our island falls, then we will fight them in the empire, and we will fight until the new world comes to redress the balance of the old. So he's explicit with the public that the decision to fight this war might be utterly ruinous, but if we go down, we will go down in a glorious act of heroic sacrifice that secures the world for the future. But he's explicit that we could lose. And that's something that has gone missing, I think, from kind of heroic rhetoric more recently. The idea, Churchill offers blood, sweat, tears and toil. Boris Johnson offers cake. And I think that is a little bit of a falling away.
Interested to hear your views on Churchill's performance at Delta. What role did he play? How was he perceived by a motley crew? And was the cult of his personality a positive factor in terms of allowing Britain to play a role above its station, really, in the kind of shaping of the world order and for World War II?
I think his personality does play a role. But on the other hand, the reason that Britain is a major player in the post-war conferences is fundamentally because it has, 6 million men-at-arms at the time. If you think of Britain and its empire, then Britain is probably at the peak of its military strength in 1945. It has very large numbers of troops in Europe and around the world. So this is, again, why I think we have to be wary of the sort of it's all about willpower reading of Winston Churchill. What gives Churchill power, and he knows this, is the fact that he has the most colossal global war machine behind him.
I mean, very brief. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, including his relationship with Stalin is a fascinating question, because a man of destiny sees another man of destiny. I think we're going to get on. And in some ways, Churchill was a little duped. I mean, that sense of destiny, and he felt betrayed after 1945. The other really interesting conference is Potsdam, because it happened during the election, and the election result came halfway through the Potsdam conference. And apparently Stalin sent Churchill back from Potsdam to hear the results and sort of said, see you in a week, because presumably you fixed that, right? And back come Attlee and Bevin, who are in many ways more, I mean, Churchill becomes as anti-Stalinist as you can get, but Attlee and Bevin are absolutely adamant that they're not going to be fooled. They've spent their life fighting communist infiltration of the Labour Party, and they are not going to fall for Stalin for a second. And there's so many things you can say about that, but one of them is, isn't democracy an extraordinary thing? I mean, it's a bit like, though it wasn't an election, but I can remember reading about Americans' complete astonishment when Margaret Thatcher was replaced by John Major just as we were about to embark on the Gulf War. They're like, Thatcher is Britain. Who is this guy? Who is Attlee? But that's how our politics works.
Yeah.
And it is a testament to it.
But Churchill gets a lot of very concerned messages from leading Soviets because they assume that, now he's been removed from power, he'll be executed or thrown out of a window. and he writes back saying, no, don't worry, merely one of the forms of hard labour that the British state reserves.
Thank you. Churchill always knew that the outcome of the Second World War relied on getting the US engaged. And he was helped a lot by Pearl Harbor and Hitler then declaring war on Germany, but a lot seemed to hang off his personal relationship with Roosevelt. Could you comment on that? And could you also comment on whether there are lessons there for the relationship between Starmer and Trump?
Yes, it was an absolute priority for Churchill to bring the United States into the war from the very beginning. But he also knew that that wasn't going to happen quickly, that it was something he was going to have to cultivate slowly. He was very aware of the strong well of opinion in the United States that felt that the US had been dragged into wars on behalf of Europe before, that it had been used as Europe's muscle, that its young men had been killed in large numbers for a cause in which the US had nothing at stake. So he knew that there was a danger in appearing to try to be the warmonger who's pushing the US into conflict. So he focuses on building a relationship with Roosevelt and building a relationship with senior American politicians. But I think when we talk about the special relationship, we often focus on the relationship between the principals. How well do the president and the prime minister get on? And that clearly is important. But really what holds the relationship together are the things beneath it. It's the trade relations, it's the military relationships, it's the intelligence relationships. And Churchill knew that he was going to have to pay for American support, that he was going to have to hand over British naval bases, that he was going to have to withdraw British influence from parts of the world, that he was going to have to weaken the sterling area, that he was going to have to make serious sacrifices of things that mattered to Britain. The idea that if you can just sort of cozy up to a president and make them your friends and everything is going to be okay, that was not an illusion under which Churchill ever suffered.
And just on the Starmer-Trump question, I know that there are people in and around the Starmer administration who think there is a lesson from this period, but the lesson is not Churchill and Roosevelt, it's Attlee and Truman, and it's after 1945, and that a Labour Party that contained many strands within it that were suspicious of the United States. The Labour Party has always contained strands that were suspicious of American capitalism and American influence in the world, nonetheless understood that at that point, Britain's future depended on holding that relationship together. And it's a judgment question, but I think there is a case for thinking that for Starmer, the historical analogy for the judgment he has to make is not what happened before 1945, but what happened after. We have a new episode out on PPF Plus, a bonus to accompany our series on the history of revolutionary ideas. It's out now, and this one is me talking about Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto, a completely extraordinary document. And in this episode, I talk about a lot of different things: cars and ships, absurdity, bicycles, the First World War, cod liver oil, fascism, the rubbish that comes out of Silicon Valley. Weirdly, the Futurist Manifesto connects all of that. Here's a little clip. In 1919, Marinetti wrote another manifesto. It's not an update of the Futurist Manifesto. It's a new manifesto for a new political party. It's a very short document, even shorter than the Futurist Manifesto, and it was called the Fascist Manifesto. So Marinetti wrote the founding document of Mussolini's fascists, which is a shocking thing. It sounds shocking. Futurism becomes fascism. It's worth reading the 1919 Fascist Manifesto because one of the things that's shocking about it is it's a very unshocking document. It's almost kind of hard to imagine Marinetti writing it because it's very tame and cautious, and it's pretty reasonable. The Fascist Manifesto is in favour of a minimum wage, minimum retirement age being dropped from 65 to 55. So it wants people to be able to retire at 55. It wants an 8-hour working day. It wants a wealth tax. It wants an abolition of church privileges. It's a manifesto for a political party that one could imagine being very popular, offering the workers in particular many of the things that would have seemed great. If you'd like to get that episode, all you have to do is subscribe to PPF Plus. It's very easy. Just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. It costs £5 a month or £50 for the year. And when you subscribe, all of our bonus episodes will be there waiting for you. That's more than a year's worth. More than 25 bonus episodes are there now. You'll get all our future bonuses and you'll get ad-free listening. And you'll be supporting this podcast. So do please give it a go. We've got a couple more episodes on revolutionary ideas before we do something a little bit different. They're about two political figures who, for some people, are the definitive revolutionaries. I'm going to be talking to the historian of Russia, Edward Acton, about Lenin and Trotsky. After that, a short series, an interlude, before we come back to more revolutionary ideas. It's been suggested by listeners, but also some of our regular contributors, and I hope you'll understand the reason why. It's a history of ideas of globalization, just in case globalization is about to end. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.